After years of war, are we finally seeing the end game in Syria?
We are close to them, maybe 300 meters, not more. Anyone they see, they will shoot him. Anyone they see, they will shoot him immediately.
With a ceasefire now apparently in place in Aleppo, we're devoting the whole of tonight's Newsnight to Syria, and we'll be asking 4 questions. What's happening on the ground? Is Assad now on the brink of victory in the Syrian civil war? Is the international order being reshaped thanks to Russia's ascendance? And could anything have been done to stop this?
Are you truly incapable of shame? Is there literally nothing that can shame you? Is there no act of barbarism against civilians, no execution of a child that gets under your skin, that just creeps you out a little bit?
Strong words from the Americans, but is it too late for Aleppo? We'll attempt to answer these questions with the help of experts, politicians and witnesses on the ground. Good evening. The House of Commons heard today that doctors in improvised clinics in the Syrian city of Aleppo are wearing boots because there is so much blood on the floor. The surviving patients are, in many ways, the lucky ones. According to the United Nations, pro-government forces in the east of the city have been killing civilians, among them women and children, in their homes and on the streets. Streets which the UN's Human Rights Office described as being full of bodies. The rebels, who have held the east of the city for 4 years, are now on the brink of defeat. Tonight, as Russia's UN ambassador said a ceasefire was in place and a deal allowing them to leave the city would be enacted within hours, we ask whether that defeat would signal the beginning of the end of the Syrian civil war and deliver victory to the Russian and Iranian-backed President Bashar al-Assad. And does Vladimir Putin's crucial role signal a further crystallization of lasting change to the established world order? We will also consider whether the West, most obviously the UK and Barack Obama's America, could have, even should have, done more to staunch the flow of civilian blood.
Before social media, a besieged city would track not just civilians, but information. Now, as pro-government forces advance on eastern Aleppo, horror stories seep out like blood under a locked door.
To everyone who can hear me, we are here exposed to a genocide in the besieged city of Aleppo. This may be my last video. More than 50,000 of civilians who rebelled against the dictator al-Assad are threatened with field executions or dying under bombing.
These people shown on Syrian television appear able to escape. However, not everyone encircled by pro-government forces feels it's safe for them to flee.
We are close to them, maybe 300 meters, not more. Captured any neighborhood. First thing they do to kill everyone, they enter this building. Anyone they see, they will shoot him. Anyone they see, they will shoot him immediately.
We cannot, of course, independently verify any of this, but the physical damage is beyond dispute. Aleppo's medieval fortifications blown apart by modern war. The UN is convinced that what is happening here is, quote, a meltdown of humanity.
The reports we've had are both being shot in the street or trying to flee and shot in their homes. Obviously people are being killed by the incredibly intense bombardment as well. So we've also had reports that, bodies lying in the streets and people unable to pick up those bodies, retrieve them, because of the intensity of the bombardment and the fear of themselves being shot.
This is the image that the Syrian government wants the world to see. Grateful residents returning to a liberated city. We don't know how many people, though, are left in the contested parts. As the remaining rebel fighters are squeezed into a smaller and smaller footprint, so the suffering of the civilians who are left there intensifies.
The civilians are stuck in a very small area that doesn't exceed 2 square kilometers, with no safe zone, no life. Every bomb is a new massacre. Save Aleppo, saving humanity.
Tonight at the UN, Russia, which supports the Syrian government, declared a ceasefire is imminent. The counter-terrorism operation in Aleppo, announced Ambassador Vitaly Churkin, will conclude in the next few hours. The battle for Aleppo, 4 years of grinding, bloody conflict, looks like it might be about to end, in victory for the Assad government and their Russian backers.
David Grossman reporting there on today's events. Time now to turn our attention to tonight. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, has been watching developments from Beirut, and she joins me from there now. Lise, no shortage of contradiction or indeed confusion. What can we say about the very latest developments with confidence?
We can say for confidence that the rebellion in East Aleppo is over. The rebellion, which began in July 2012, in which at one point in the years that followed seemed at the point of capturing all of Aleppo, to the point that a commander of a pro-government militia told me last week in Aleppo that they had been reduced to just 3 streets. What a turnaround it has been for the Syrian army and its allies, most importantly Russia, and an array of militias backed by Iran. It is a huge victory, the most significant victory of the war for the Syrian government, for President Bashar al-Assad. But the future of Aleppo, a city divided, ripped, shredded, where kilometre after kilometre, when you drive through the east of Aleppo, all there are streets drained of life and colour, haunted by the memories of what has gone on in the past 4 years. What we do know is that tomorrow morning, if it's on time, and it won't be, but sometime tomorrow, the rebel fighters and their family will leave the battlefields of Aleppo, leave their dreams and their goals and their defiance behind, and go to the city of Idlib in the west under opposition control, or go further north to fight another day in the area controlled by Kurdish fighters and Turkish troops.
Lise Doucette, many thanks indeed. We are joined now by Lord Ashdown, who was, of course, the UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina in the aftermath of their civil war. But first, Bashar Farhat, who fled from Syria in 2013 and arrived in the UK as a refugee in March of last year. Bashar, it's harrowing enough to see such pictures from a country one has never visited. What is it like to see such pictures from one's home?
We used to watch, unfortunately, this picture and this ongoing massacre for 6 years. It's just sometimes getting disaster to the extent that it hits the top news. But it has been the same since 2011, the Syrian regime killing our people every single day. And for me, Aleppo is my city, and I spent quite a long time in Aleppo. It's quite disastrous. We expected Aleppo the resistance to fall down and to end, but we always expected that it might be the same as what happened in different areas in Syria, at least keeping a safe passage for civilians to survive. But what's going on, it's a live broadcasted massacre, and they are not giving any chance, any opportunity for these people to survive.
Have you been in touch with people in the city recently?
Yeah, I have many friends there, and I have colleagues who used to work in the hospitals there, trying to help people, and hospitals, of course, have been targeted for quite a long time, so there are no working hospitals for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. And yeah, today I could be in touch with a colleague who is a medical doctor there, and he just could say that he's still alive. And all our colleagues or our friends are just sending their very last messages, knowing that they will die at any moment.
They expect to die at the hands of government forces.
Yeah. They, after hearing of the field execution, killing people who fled to the regime areas, no one wants to experience to be detained or tortured or killed by the militias or the Syrian regime. So they prefer to die where they belong, to die in their homes, in their hospitals, with their beloved ones.
There's no optimism, for want of a better word, to be derived from this apparent ceasefire announced tonight?
We hope so. I think there is always optimism, but we are speaking about hours, and every single hour hundreds of people are being killed. If we are speaking about 50,000 people trapped in 2 to 3 kilometers squared, so every bomb could cause a massacre. So this optimism of having a ceasefire tomorrow morning might cause 20 or 30,000, we don't know, a huge number. The civil defense in Syria yesterday couldn't count the number of people who are killed, of the bodies over the streets. They couldn't count them. So we are speaking about tens of people are being killed every single hour.
Bashar Farhat, many thanks indeed for your time tonight. Paddy Ashdown, obviously it's a statement of the obvious to say that most people watching will feel some desperate need to do something. Is there anything that we could have done or could do now?
James, you asked, listening to Bashar, it's impossible to find words to... You asked what's going on the ground. The answer is a Golgotha is in place and it's in train. You asked earlier on, is this the end for Aleppo? Yes, it is, but it must not be the end for the 50,000 people who are now trapped in 4 square miles. Every bomb is a massacre, Bashar said, and that's what's now at risk. Look, the West, I'm afraid to say, these last 5 years has deliberately and almost thoughtfully put itself in the position, manoeuvred itself into the position where it is now an impotent bystander. It has no leverage. It has leverage to do one thing now, and this has got to be the first priority of the entire Western effort, is those 50,000 people. There must not be another Srebrenica. I remember the aftermath of that. I was in Bosnia when it happened. Exactly the same conditions are now being repeated. There is nothing else that matters in the next 24 hours or 36 hours than those 50,000 people trapped in those 4 square miles. We've got to get them out, and we've got to get them to safety. Beyond that, there are things the West can do, I think. We might discuss.
I just want to draw back first, if I may. The 50,000 civilians in need of rescue, as you describe it, do you have faith that the ceasefire will hold? And surely, regardless of what your answer is to that question, we can only do what the Russians would let us do.
Yeah, no, I don't have faith, but I think there are things you can do. You can send a UN mission, an observer mission in there. You can insist that they go in. I find it difficult to believe that the Russians would not permit a UN...
Why hasn't it happened already?
Well, that's a very good question. There are all sorts of things that haven't happened already. I mean, you know, I go back to that vote of 2013 when our parliament refused to take action in the face of Bashar al-Assad being using chemical weapons. I remember saying at the time that that was the most shameful vote I'd ever participated in parliament, so it has proved to be true, and there's now a price to pay for that. The West has lost any potency that it had in terms of what it will do. It's lost the will to act. Russia's taken advantage of that, moved into the vacuum. Thousands have been killed. Here's my bleak guess. What can the West do now, apart from trying to save those 50,000? The answer is bluntly not much. It doesn't have much leverage on the ground.
So moving away from the guess and
well,
back
let me tell you what I think might happen next,
please,
perhaps.
yes, of course.
I mean, look, I watched this in Bosnia. Ceasefires don't work until both sides believe they have nothing further to gain on the battlefield. My guess is that Assad and the Russians decided that they were not in that position, that they had to take Aleppo before they could have a ceasefire. I don't think Russia wants to be involved in the long term in this. They know they'll get bogged down. I suspect that now both sides have come to a position where everything they could gain on the battlefield more or less has been gained. Aleppo is theirs. And the conditions now for some kind of peace. Let me warn you, it'll be rough, it'll be bloody, it will be untidy, it will be dominated by warlords, much as it'll be Bosnia written on a large scale. I think the right thing now is to have a Dayton-type regional agreement where you assert the integrity of the political space of Syria as unassailable. That involves the neighbours, Iran, Turkey, etc., underpinned as guarantor by the great powers. That could bring some kind of peace. Let me tell you, it'll be a horrible peace to observe, but I can promise you that every single citizen living in Aleppo, trapped between the barrel bombs of Assad and the knives of ISIL, will prefer a peace, however untidy, to the continuation of this war. I watched it in Sarajevo, and it's exactly the same conditions all over again.
Paddy Ashdown, many thanks. He never expected to be president. After a stint as an army doctor, Bashar al-Assad was doing postgraduate studies at the Western Eye Hospital in London when he was recalled to Damascus in 1994 after his brother and the heir apparent to the Syrian presidency died in a car crash. 6 years later, he succeeded his father to that presidency, and when ripples from the Arab Spring unfolding across much of the Middle East reached Syria in early 2011, his uncompromising response to pro-democracy protesters effectively constituted the opening shots of what would become a bloody civil war. A war he now seems vanishingly close to winning, but it didn't always seem such a sure thing. Months into the conflict, the UN condemns human rights violations in Syria, with US and EU demands that Assad steps down. An attempt by the UN Security Council to pass a resolution condemning the regime fails after Russia and China veto it. An early peace plan devised by the Arab League also fails. Amid continuing international condemnation of the regime, President Obama threatens intervention if there's any use of chemical or biological weapons.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
By the end of the year, a series of countries, including the US, Britain and some Gulf states, formally recognise the opposition National Coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. In August, a chemical assault on a Damascus suburb kills 1,400 people. The US blames Assad, despite denials by Damascus. President Obama says he is resolved to take military action, but will seek congressional approval. In the UK, Parliament defeats proposals by Prime Minister David Cameron to take action against Assad. By the end of the year, more than 2 million refugees have fled to neighbouring countries, and more than 100,000 are dead. Attempts at peace talks in Geneva come to nothing, and a report by Human Rights Watch concludes that Assad has used chlorine gas in rebel-held areas. The report suggests Syrian forces dropped barrel bombs containing chlorine from helicopters. By the end of the year, forces from the US and 5 Arab countries are carrying out airstrikes against IS. A game changer. Russia gets involved and carries out airstrikes in Syria targeting IS in September. However, the West and Syrian opposition claim the attacks overwhelmingly target anti-Assad rebels.
It's the Hillary ban.
After another vote, the UK joins bombing raids against IS in December following the Paris terror attacks. A US-Russian brokered partial ceasefire was concluded in February but failed to hold. And now, here we are, with Assad and Russian forces finally seizing Aleppo's rebel-held areas. I should mention here that we have tried to speak to representatives of both the Russian and the Syrian governments, but no one wanted to talk. Our Middle East editor is, of course, Jeremy Bowen, and joining us from New York is Reza Afshar, the policy director at Independent Diplomat and an advisor to the Syrian opposition. He was formerly head of Syria policy at the Foreign Office. The picture, Jeremy, that Paddy Ashdown painted was almost unrelentingly bleak. It seems odd to use a word like victory in that context, but do you think that Assad will be feeling like a winner tonight?
Yeah, he will. He's written off so much. I remember at the beginning of the war, there were even reports going around that he had taken refuge on a Russian battleship in the Mediterranean. So, going from that to this is huge. It's his biggest victory of the war, but I'd say it is not the end of the war. I think the war is changing its shape, and it may be, as Paddy Ashdown was saying, that they have now got to a point where they more or less fought each other to a standstill, or there could be other things to do. Let's not forget, Islamic State still held their corner of Syria. They've actually retaken parts of Palmyra in the last few days under the curtain of everything that's been going on in Aleppo, and the rebels themselves hold quite a bit of territory. So I think that while a lot of foreign powers are still very, very involved in what's happening in Syria, it's become almost like a mini world war. It is therefore exponentially more difficult to try to bring a diplomatic solution to all of this. And, you know, we saw in the Security Council today, there was tremendous acrimony between all the sides. They'd have to agree something to get them all together.
And the notion of the ear of Assad, would anyone except Putin in that Security Council have the ear of Assad?
I think the Russians very definitely have the ear of Assad. I think that, you know, if you, as I've done, you go to the Ministry of Defence in Damascus, and you go into the offices of generals, and they are full of textbooks in Russian about military tactics and little commemorative shields from units that they'd visited in Russia, and the kind of thing that senior officers give each other when they meet and have lunch and so on. They are really that tight. And so I think as a result of that, not only does Assad have the ear of Putin and the other way around, the Russians really know who's further down the chain as well when it comes to Syria. And one of the problems the West has had is really, relatively speaking, a lot more ignorance about what's been happening. Plus, of course, the Russians have had this remarkable, they've had a lot of clarity in their policy. They knew what they wanted, support Assad, their man, and they've gone to get it. The West has been all over the place in comparison, because they've, you know, the Western side has shown the complexity of the issue, but that has been a bit befuddled about what to do next.
Indeed. Jeremy Bowen, thank you very much indeed. Reza, I'll come to you now, if I may. The consensus seems to be that while things may not be quite over yet, it is perhaps the beginning of the end. Would you agree with that analysis?
No, I would wholeheartedly disagree with it. I think the fact that Aleppo is on the brink of being taken and Assad feels like he's winning doesn't mean that he is winning. He has to take ground and he has to hold ground. He doesn't have the military capability to hold ground. And as we've seen, what happens when forces are focused in one place, like in Aleppo, is that other places get taken and retaken. And the moderate rebel groups who were in fact fighting ISIS also have to focus their efforts on the regime, who is killing people, civilians, on a day-to-day basis, because only suddenly they are really in a position to protect any of the civilian population. So what you're getting will be continual opening up of fronts all over the country. And if I may, I'd take issue with something that Lord Ashdown said earlier. I agreed with a lot of what he said, but the idea that the West doesn't have leverage to deal with this issue is simply wrong. You create the leverage, and you create that by creating consequences for the actions that the Syrian government and the Russians are taking. If you fire a cruise missile from a ship onto the end of a Syrian runway, I think their behaviour would change quite quickly. The Obama administration could have done that at any point during this conflict, and it has chosen not to.
You say at any point during this conflict, surely that would hold truer up until the point that the Russians got involved, because to fire a cruise missile at a Syrian runway possibly being used by Russian planes would be an act of provocation.
No, not at all, because I think with the amount of assets that are already in the region fighting ISIS, the coverage is pretty good, and I think with some clarity we could say which targets have that risk of hitting Russians and which don't. At the end of the day, the Russians don't respond to negotiation. We can see that they respond to a stepping up of military action, and the Obama administration has failed to do that. And I think Samantha Power saying today in the Security Council that the Russians should be ashamed. Yes, the Russians should be ashamed, but the Americans also have to answer the question as to why they haven't taken the action to protect civilians in Syria when they have the means to do so.
Do you think that's likely to happen? Because they talked of red lines with the deployment of chemical weaponry. Barack Obama, of course, famously said you can't cross that line. They did. Nothing happened. What's changed? Why would you be more optimistic about intervention now in the final days of Barack Obama's regime?
No, I'm not optimistic about it. I don't think this president will do anything in that regard. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that there are tools that can be used to bring this conflict to an end. And when Lord Ashdown talked about a Dayton process, like in Bosnia, I agree with him. There does need to be some kind of negotiation. But the point about Dayton was that what brought the Serbs to the table was when NATO started bombing the Serbs. At the end of the day, there has to be a coercive element to policy in Syria. That coercive element is completely missing. And that is why people are suffering. But more importantly, it is why we face a daily terror threat in Europe and the US. It is why that there is a refugee exodus that is tearing the fabric of Europe apart. Syria touches every single one of us in terms of the consequences that it has on us. And it is in the US self-interest, in European self-interest, to take action to reduce the impact of this conflict, and they have the means to do it.
Reza Afshar, thank you very much indeed. And of course, Jeremy Bowen. Now, as we've just been hearing, when Barack Obama elected not to intervene in what he saw as another Muslim civil war in the Middle East, the then Saudi ambassador to Washington, Adel al-Jubeir, reported back to Riyadh that Iran is the new great power of the Middle East and the US is the old. Talk of a new world order traditionally seems a little over the top, but if 2016 has taught us anything, it is that what once seemed fanciful can quickly become reality. Factor in also that Russia, Iran's co-sponsors of the Assad regime, subsequently came to play a massive part in that suppression of the rebellion, and you're left with a very real sense of a seismic shift in the power structures of the region, and so the world. We asked the historian, Timothy Garton Ash, to give us his assessment of where the world stands as 2016 draws to a close.
I think Vladimir Putin will have a very happy Christmas. In fact, he's been known to croon, and I think he may be crooning, "Everything's going my way." In Syria, he has relentlessly and successfully prosecuted a war at the side of the Assad regime with cynical indifference to massive civilian casualties and suffering, and he's almost won. In the United States, Russian hackers have contributed directly to the defeat of Hillary Clinton. So Putin has now got the most Russia-friendly president he could possibly hope for in Donald Trump, and now a new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who is an oil man, a buddy of his, actually opposed sanctions over Crimea. In Europe, Putin can contemplate with delight the rise of populists in every corner and the partial disintegration of the European Union. Brexit was a gift to him. I just come back from Paris, where he has an amazing prospect. In the second round of the presidential election, Marine Le Pen of the National Front versus François Fillon, the one almost as pro-Putin as the other. And now in Germany, they're talking about the danger of Russian hackers again influencing the election results. I think that's been a great year for Vladimir Putin. So some would say, is this a new world order? I would say, if you mean by a new world order an old world disorder, then at the moment, yes. We're back to a world where great powers are relentlessly pursuing their national and imperial interests, also by the use of military force. Will it last? My answer is no. I think one of the lessons of modern history is that dictatorships tend to win in the short term, but democracies win out in the long term.
Sir Anthony Brenton was the British ambassador to Russia between 2004 and 2008. He joins me in the studio now. Sir Anthony, I think, and one hesitates to say anything like this with confidence, but everyone tonight seems to agree on one thing, and that is that Vladimir Putin emerges from this unholy mess greatly enhanced.
I think that has to be right. I mean, the Russians have gone into Syria with a much clearer view of what they wanted than we did.
What did they want?
Well, they have an Islamist problem of their own at home.
Yes.
We all remember the Beslan massacre. They saw the choice in Syria as being between Assad, whom they really don't like. They know what a deplorable president he is. But they saw the alternative as being extremist Islam taking over. And while extremist Islam is undoubtedly a threat to Russia, Assad really isn't. So they very firmly put their money on Assad, not their money, but their bombs, and have vigorously supported him through to the situation we're in now.
And yet, much of the coverage suggests that they've dedicated more attention to what we could loosely describe as the moderate rebel groups than the actual jihadists or Islamists.
I think their view is that that's a distinction without a difference. Their view is that the backbone of the opposition are, in fact, Islamists. The moderates are there for Western politicians to say we're backing the good guys, but actually the core of the opposition, and this is pretty clear actually from what everybody has seen, were Islamists. If they had won, even if nice moderate faces had been put in charge, the Islamists would very rapidly have taken over, and they weren't going to let that happen.
So David Cameron was wrong then in 2013 to speak of moderate rebel groups who we could realistically support with the hope of overcoming Assad and not leaving the door open for ISIL or Daesh.
I'm afraid the evidence is very much against him. You will recall a CIA exercise called Train and Equip. At about the time that Cameron said that, which was designed to produce moderate armed forces, which spent $1 billion and produced something like 10 soldiers. They all defected to the extremists as soon as they'd had the training.
So Barack Obama then was probably right to choose not to get involved, because if he did, he wouldn't have been able to pick a side.
That's right. I mean, our problem right from the beginning has been, well, we made a huge mistake at the beginning by saying Assad must go. It then became apparent...
What would you have done?
I started my career as an Arabist. I have seen the region get worse and worse and worse, and I've seen Western interventions, on the whole, making it worse rather than better.
Yes.
I was heavily involved in the Iraq exercise. I watched Libya. I watched our encouragement to President Mubarak to quit the presidency of Egypt. On each occasion, it has left a situation worse than the one we started with. I'm afraid that this is a region which finally has to solve its own problems. We can't, I mean, there's all this talk now about atrocities and so on, which is right, and it's obviously what's happened is appalling. But in the absence of any very clear ability on the part of the West to improve the situation rather than damage it, we should be very careful about getting involved at all.
And finally, slightly in a different direction, the reports that Russia may have interfered in the election of Donald Trump, with your background, which you've just described, how important do you think that story may prove to be?
Well, I think it'll go away, but, I mean, it is pretty clear that the Russians did the hacking. It is unclear why they did it. I'm not entirely persuaded they backed Trump, because actually at the time everybody expected Hillary Clinton to win, and they're not going to set themselves up against a winner. But it's a sign of a new technological means for the Russians to interfere in our political processes, and we're going to have to equip ourselves to deal with that.
Sir Anthony Brenton, many thanks indeed. Now, British politicians remain fiercely divided over the question of what, if anything, they could have done differently. David Cameron's failure to secure that parliamentary support for attacks on Assad in 2013 is seen as one of the reasons, not one of the biggest reasons actually, but one of the reasons behind Barack Obama's decision not to intervene. But perhaps the best illustration of just how confused and confusing the conflict became appeared 2 years later, when Parliament voted to commence airstrikes on parts of Syria. But they, of course, were the parts then occupied by ISIL, themselves ostensibly opponents of the Assad regime. Former Chancellor George Osborne, nonetheless, told the House of Commons earlier today that he, at least, is clear about where responsibility for the escalation lay.
The tragedy in Aleppo did not come out of a vacuum. It was created by a vacuum of Western leadership, of American leadership, British leadership. I take responsibility as someone who sat on the National Security Council throughout those years. Parliament should take its responsibility because of what it prevented being done. And there were multiple opportunities to intervene.
I'm joined now by the Labour MP for Wirral South, Alison McGovern, and the Times columnist, Matthew Parris. Matthew, I'll begin with you, if I may. There seems in the worlds of politics and journalism to be a great compunction to pick a side. Do you think we should have picked a side sooner and more clearly?
I think we picked the wrong side. I don't think we were in any position to know who the rebels were, what form of government they might be able to establish, or how we would be able to underpin that government. I'm far from saying that we should have supported Assad, but I'm not sure that we should have opposed him. I think we should have stood back. As it turns out, Assad has won. As it turns out, he was in a much stronger position than our diplomats, our ambassador, said that he would fall within weeks, and our security and intelligence advisors advised us. I think it's a great mistake. I just heard George Osborne saying there were many opportunities to intervene. There are many opportunities to intervene, but you need to know what it is you're going to intervene to do. And I don't think we ever had a clear view of who the rebels were, which rebels we wanted to win, what sort of government they could form, or whether the West could really underpin that government. And so we didn't make the mistake that we made in Libya by toppling Gaddafi without knowing what would follow.
Alison McGovern, the question of what we should do now was what the House of Commons was contending with today. It perhaps would have been nicer to see a few more people sitting on the benches, but is it a top priority, do you think, for British politicians or indeed for Theresa May's government?
Well, I want to make it one because I think that the kind of events we've seen in Aleppo over the past 24 hours, and in fact over months and months and months now, are an offence to basic humanity. I think all of us look at that and think, it's easy to have a council of despair and say there's absolutely nothing we can do. But we do have tools at our disposal, and I think rather than seeing this as picking sides, 10 years ago we all stood up and said, broadly, people in the international community think that there is a responsibility to protect civilians, and it's not about one individual tactic that can make that happen. It's about a range of things that we can do, whether it's sanctions, diplomacy, judicious use of credible force to shift the balance of power. Whatever that strategy is, that's the way that the world should lead to say this is not acceptable. And all really people were asking for in the House of Commons today was for the Foreign Secretary to bring forward such a strategy to protect civilians. And there's a perfect opportunity at the end of this week with the European Council for the Prime Minister to still, at this late stage, show leadership and say, look, the international community believes that there are certain things that are not right, and here's what we will do to uphold those values and offer civilians, people who are not combatants but rather innocent victims of this conflict, a hand in friendship and try and get them to safety.
Russian permission permitting, but very briefly, let's just go back 3 years. Your party whipped against intervention. You presumably voted against.
I did.
So George Osborne effectively suggesting today that you have some blood on your hands.
Firstly, the Russians they've already previously signed up to getting aid into Syria, so we're only asking them to do what they've said already. And, I said in the House of Commons
Let me just steer you back to George Osborne, implying that people like you were responsible for what's happening today.
I think George Osborne and I actually agreed in the House that all of us live with our votes, whether in 2013 or at any point, all the time.
Do you accept his analysis? Do you regret the way that your party whipped its members and indeed the way that you voted?
I think that he was... No, I know, let me just explain. When the Prime Minister responded to that vote, and he said, I think words the effect of I get that, what I regret is that we left it there. Whether or not we were right at that moment, whether or not the government had proved the case, to be honest with you, I think that you can argue it either way. I regret, in my own actions, not challenging them more, not bringing it forward more, but in the end, David Cameron was the Prime Minister and George Osborne was the Chancellor, and as he and I agreed in the chamber today, we all have to take our share of the responsibility. But even at this late stage, I still think that we should be pushing for Britain to take a lead, along with our international partners, to try and help do something.
Matthew Parris, one phrase that resonates back from 2013 was Crispin Blunt, actually, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Select Committee now, and he spoke of being relieved of our imperial pretensions, or something like that, as you've suggested this evening, it wasn't really our fight to get involved in at all.
And I agree entirely with Alison about the ought. Ought implies can.
Yes.
And there's a great limit to what we can do. And I think there was an understanding in the House of Commons at that vote that there was a limit to what we could do. There still is a limit to what we could do. It's probably necessary now that somebody wins in Aleppo. It can't carry on like this. Perhaps we can do something to mitigate whatever harm Bashar al-Assad might do. Perhaps we can do something to protect people. But probably somebody has to win. And on balance, I think it's probably better. It probably has to be Bashar al-Assad at the moment.
Even though our guest earlier, the refugee who's now, actually I should have mentioned, working as a teaching assistant in a Scottish secondary school, it's pretty clear that he thinks everyone might end up dead if things continue to unfold.
I would imagine that whoever wins, lots of people are going to end up dead.
just don't feel that there's any sense in which anyone can be described as winning. This is just the most horrific situation. I don't think I know what you're trying to say, but I just think this is such a disastrous situation that really...
I don't want to sound crass, Alison McGovern, but that's war, isn't it? I mean, it's ugly and it's bloody and it very rarely delivers neat resolutions.
That's exactly why Andrew Mitchell and I and others have come to the House and said this is about the international humanitarian law being at stake, about the rules by which war is governed by, any sense of, you know, protecting hospitals, doctors, vulnerable children. That's been gone out the window in this conflict. So of course you're right that this is a step beyond.
If we're to protect hospitals and doctors and refugees, we probably have to protect ISIS, ISIL, whatever we call them. We probably have to bomb the Russians. We probably have to attack Russian warplanes. We really are not in the position to get into that sort of thing.
And we are not, sadly, in possession of enough time to get into that sort of observation at this point. Matthew Parris, Alison McGovern, many thanks indeed to both of you tonight. And that is indeed all from us for tonight. We'll leave you with images from the city of Aleppo, where it seems President Assad's forces may soon be back in complete control. Good night.
أنزلت حبك في آهي فشددها أنزلت حبك في آهي فشددها طربت